Good morning everyone and welcome back to day 23 of 100 Days of Code, or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. So yesterday we were looking at this useReducer function that comes with React, and Max has just given me a bit more information on this now. So what's actually going on is this is still just managing the state of something, which we did know from using it yesterday, but confirmation, this is just managing the state like the use state. And it just takes in slightly different things. So we have the thing that we want to manage the state of. So this is, the state snapshot. So the thing we want to manage the state of. Then we have the function that we want to update this state, the state of this particular item. So it's the same as the use state in this side of the equation. Then we pass over the function. So this is the reducer function, and this is the function that triggers automatically once the action is dispatched, right? So basically this is just another function that's triggered automatically. So this function is triggered automatically. This is the function we use to update this constant. And then you also just pass in the initial state that you started with. So in this case it's just an empty string, and then the initial value that you started with as well. So that's all we're doing. It is another way to manage the state, just a slightly more complex way, like if you want to do a more complex state management. So that's cool. Now we know, like I can confirm it's definitely the same thing. So I'm just watching the video. So I'm just listening to Max here, and then we're going to continue to use this useReducer inbuilt React functionality in order to capture the state of our emails and our passwords, and also the validation of those items, so we can just do it all together instead of having, before we had loads of different use states, and it just wasn't great because they can be updated at different times. So this is a better approach. So let's continue to learn more about this useReducer approach to managing states in React. Okay. So the first thing that we pass into this dispatch email function is just a string identifier. So I've just put in user input because that's a string identifying what's going on here, and then the value itself, that's what you pass in to this function in order to capture the state of the email state. So when we use this function here, we are doing an action, we're running a function to update the state of the thing that we've declared. And this is just the particular format that we're using now. We could have just even passed through a number in here, you know. It doesn't have to be this object. So you should just go and have a little quick read of the documentation, actually, you know, on the React website. Okay. I'm just laughing because my browser is still set to default with Edge. I literally don't even know how that happened, and I just need to change it. But you know what, it brings me quite a lot of joy, like just seeing this browser open it up, so I might leave it. No, I will change it, but yeah, I don't know why this, but it's because it's set to my default somehow. Okay, so I want the actual React website hooks. Yeah, so this is a hook. So yes, here we go. Our basic hooks are use state, use effect, and use context, and then additional hooks, useReducer. Cool. Great. So we have it here. It's saying it. That is great. You know what? It was well worth just coming and reading the official documentation. anyone learning, for a long time I never came to the official documentation. I know that's not a good thing, but the JavaScript, the MDN documents for a while were a bit too complex for me, and I was like, I don't know what this abstract functions mean. But the React.js documentation is very literal. It gives good actual examples. They talk through solutions. So it's not as abstract as the MDN docs, and now I love the MDN docs. Like, you just need to get used to them, and it's where you're going to find the most up-to-date content. And really, you should be looking at the docs and trying to understand the docs. It's a good practice to get into. So even though I didn't understand MDN, I'd still go and have a look, and then I'd end up going and looking at a Stack Overflow or something, because sometimes, for whatever thing I may have been looking at, I was just like, an actual code example will just make more sense for me here. But the React.js docs are great. They give actual examples, more like a Stack Overflow answer, and as opposed to the MDN, which sometimes I found a bit too abstract, and but it's a good practice. So come and have a look. And so here we've already seen, right, that this is an additional hook. So it's either a variant of the basic one from the previous section, which was use state, use effect, and some other one. Whatever the last one was. So use state, use effect, these are just like general hooks that are basic hooks. And then you have more specific edge cases, and it literally says don't stress about learning them up front. So even that's encouraging, come to the React.js documents just like, okay, well, I need to learn about this, but I don't need to stress about it, which is the case for everything in coding. So it's an alternative to use state. So it accepts a reducer of type state and action. So you pass in a state and an action, and then you get a new state. So it reduces the state, the current state, or the state of the variable that you're trying to track, and then the action that you're going to perform on that particular thing to give you a new state. So there we go. That's really helpful. And returns the current state paired with a dispatch method. If you're familiar with Redux, you already know how this works. Well, no, I don't know how this works, but that still makes sense to me. So it returns the current state. So what the item you get back is the current state that you have, paired with a dispatch method, and the dispatch must be to dispatch the update. So that's what I'm getting from that, but we'll keep reading. useReducer is preferable to use state when you have complex state logic. Okay, you can read this. I'll just make it even bigger, because why not? useReducer is preferable to use state when you have complex state logic. Okay, that involves multiple sub-values, or when the next state depends on the previous one. So we've used use state before and spread the array from the previous state. So maybe in this case a useReducer would have been better, because we were depending on previous states in previous videos, but we have only just come to this useReducer. So I think actually refactoring some old code, when we go back to our expense tracker, with the months, and I told you how much was spent in each month, that was at the beginning of this 100 days that we started doing that project, that actually seems like a good place to go in and refactor the code. And that's a good way to learn as well. If you have a new way of doing something, you can go in and refactor your old code. So like the new arrow functions in JavaScript, go to an old project that you have and try and convert them to an arrow function type of format, and that's how you will learn the most efficient way, I think, because you have to sort of understand how you get to the new way of doing it, and that's just helpful. So try that out as well. Is usually preferable to use state when you have complex logic. That's great, or involves multiple sub-values. So we have that at the moment. We're trying to track the email value itself, and also or the input into the email field, and also then the validation of that email field. So we were tracking two different states for the same box. So just putting them together makes more sense. So they can't be getting back the answers independently and maybe not having that particular value when we go to execute the code that we're looking at, because it's two different states being handled. So that's cool. Also lets you optimize performance for components that trigger deep updates. Okay, because you can pass dispatch down instead of callbacks. Okay. So this allows you to communicate down through children as well, I think. That's what that's saying, or maybe it's not. But I still feel like I understand it more, so let's keep going. Here's the counter example from the use state section, rewritten to use a reducer. So, I mean, even that's so helpful. You can go and look at the use state, how it was originally done, and see this being rewrote as a reducer instead. So here for React we have a counter, function counter, which takes in the initial count, and here's our use state declaration. So this is just declaring a variable called count. The set count is the function that we run in order to reset that count variable. So when we want to update the count, we use set count and just pass in a value that will update. So see here, we can say on the click of this button, we're just calling a function, and what we want that function to do is use this set count inbuilt function that comes with use state to update this initial count. So that's as simple as updating. That's as simple as it is to update this initial count. We just use this set count and that will update the new value. And yes, so we want to use state and we're tracking the initial count, and passing this in like this will update the count. Yes. So okay. So now we'll go and check out how it's done with useReducer. Sorry guys, it's early. So now we'll see how it's done with useReducer. So now we've declared a constant, which is an object with a key and value pair of count, and the count is set to 0. So it's a bit more verbose, but that makes sense. So we just have our initial state, which is our count set at 0. Perfect. So then we have our reducer being called here, and we pass in a state and an action, which makes perfect sense as well. And we're going to switch on an action.type. So a switch statement just says, if we have this particular thing, do this. If we have this other thing, do this. And then you can give it a default state. So yeah, that's what a switch statement is. You switch between different things that are coming in, and you execute a particular piece of code dependent on what switch has come in to your function. So here we're switching on the action.type. So we've passed in an action.type. So we just have an action coming in. We get the type out of it. So the type could be on that action object increment, or it could be decrement. That's on this action object. It could be passed in as either one of those. And if we have the increment on the action.type, then we want to return the count, which initially was set to 0. And we want to change this, so change the state of the count and add 1 to it. And if the count case is decrement, then we want to return or give back the count, the state of the count minus 1. So we're just updating this count object, either adding 1 or minusing 1, dependent on whether the action.type was increment or decrement. And then in the default case, throw an error. So if we don't have an action.type, we're going to throw an error. Okay. So yeah. So then we have our function. I don't know why that is happening, which is why I'm a bit confused, but because, well, yeah, we just wanted to throw an error because it didn't fit either of these cases, but I would have thought there might have been a slightly better way to do this, but this is just an example, and surely the React docs would give the best example, so okay, that's fine, I guess. We just want to see why it didn't do it and get our error back, and so we can have a look further at this code, because we are clearly expecting an increment or a decrement. Because if we don't get those, we are throwing an error. Okay, so then we have a function called counter, and this is where we are declaring our useReducer. So we pass in our state and our dispatch, or we declare our state and our dispatch, I should say, and then we declare the useReducer inbuilt function, which takes in the reducer and the initial state. And what this is going to return back out is the count object and the state.count, which is the same thing we have up here. We're just updating the state.count. So on button click here, we're going to run the dispatch function, which takes the type of decrement, and that's coming up here to our switch statement in order to return this, because our reducer is here, and that's what we've passed in, our reducer, which is this function, and then the initial state of our count object. So we already have the state of our count, this particular thing, so that's all being passed in. So all we need to do then is, if the type is decrement, then we run this, we come up here and we have decrement, so we return this, and then dispatch is this function that we're running in order to update the state of the state.count. And if the type is increment, well, then we're going to come in here and come into this particular case and run this block of code, which is just going to increment the state by 1. So okay, yes, that does make sense to me, but I guess I just need to do a little bit more practice of it until, you know, it clicks. But that makes sense, that does make sense. Okay, so it's a more complex way of tracking the state of something. You have your state and your method to update the state, and then in your useReducer function you pass in your reducer, which is another function, so you can do more complex logic, and the initial state of the object that you're trying to track the state of. So okay. Okay. React guarantees that dispatch function identity is stable. Yes, that makes sense, because here we can see dispatch. Okay, right. This is why it's safe to omit from the use effect or use callback dependency list. Okay, there are 2 different ways to initialize useReducer state. You may choose either one depending on the case. The simplest way is to pass the initial state as a second argument. So yes, like this. So our initial state is the count at the initial count, which was 0. React doesn't use the state equals initial state argument convention popularized by Redux. The initial value sometimes needs to depend on props, and so is specified from the hook call instead. If you feel strongly about this, you can use useReducer undefined reducer to emulate the Redux behavior, but it is not encouraged. Okay. So that all looks okay. I understand that a bit more, so I'm going to just continue on, and hopefully you guys do too from going through that, and that wasn't more confusing, but it's made it a bit more clear to me. And everything is just practice, guys, so we just need to keep looking at this stuff, and do you know what, we'll be absolutely flying it. So practice, and the more you do, the more it becomes apparent, and don't be afraid if it's not apparent in the beginning. That's just the way of learning anything. So I'm going to just keep watching. Oh, he's talking so slow, I didn't realise. It's not on ×2, it's definitely on ×1, because it sounds like a snail. Yeah. Okay. Oh. Okay, so the value here should be event.target.value, because we have the event here. So this value should be event.target.value. Actually, event.target.value. Okay. Okay. Okay, so this will cause the email reducer function to fire, because that's what we've passed in on our dispatch email function. When we call this, we're telling it to update that email state, and this is the function that runs. So this is what's going to run when we run the email change handler, because then it runs dispatch email, which runs email reducer. So okay. Yes, so now in here we can add a check to check if the type is user input, which is how you would switch between managing the state of different objects, because we've passed in the type. So now we can say if the type equals this, do this. And then in the case that we wanted to track the state of something else, we would say if the type or the key or the value of the type that we've passed in here equals email input, then update it slightly differently. So this is how we can track the state of different things. So I was sort of wondering that when we were going through the documentation. I was like, but if I had another thing, which is what this is all about, how do I do that thing? So now it's starting to come together. So now we have if, and we pass in this particular type, if type okay, so we say if action.type, because yes, here's the action, right? So the action that we want to run, so we can have different actions. So if action.type is equal to user input, then we can do something. Okay. So this action is another object, because down here we have specified as an object. So on the dispatch email, when we're updating the email state, we've passed in this object, and the object has the type and the value. So we can access both of these in the action. So if the action.type equals user input, then we're going to do something. Yes. So now what we want to do, rather than returning an empty value, because we have the value, we know what we want to update it to, we can instead return value as action.val, because we've passed in that val. So action.val, and then is valid is going to be true because we have a value. So we'll update that as well. Okay, so what we should actually do is check here if it is valid rather than just saying true. So the way we do that is do action.file.includes. So if it includes the @ symbol, and this evaluates to true, which it should do once we passed in an actual email, then this is going to evaluate to true, so it will be true anyway. So rather than just being false, we've given it some condition to test whether or not this should be returned as true. So we have the action.file, which should be an email, and if perhaps we just typed in like some letters, so Lilly Code with no @ and no .com, well then is valid will still evaluate to false because it's not a valid email. But if we type in an action.file, which is in fact an email, or at least includes an @ symbol, we could make this check more complex to make sure it has a dot and, you know, is more of an email. But for the moment we're just checking if it has an @ symbol, and if that does evaluate to true, then well then is valid is going to be true. So that's great. Okay, yeah, so now down in our validate email handler, we also want to do something in here. So let's do that. Oh no. What? Oh, and region. I was like, what did that say? Random code writing itself. No. So now we dispatch email. Okay, yes, and we're going to pass in an object again, and we need to pass in a type and a val, because that's what we've passed in before, and we don't want it failing somewhere down along just because we didn't pass in the right object. So we pass in an object to this dispatch email update function that has, or the dispatch function I should say, that has the same structure as our other objects that we've passed to this same thing, because that's what it's expecting now. So we have a type, okay, yeah, so now we just can pass in the type of input blur, because what we want this validate email handler to do is if someone moves away from the box, then we want to be informed about it. So we pass in the type of input blur, and we don't need to type in a value in this case, because when we come in here into this email reducer and we're going to run it, we're going to return something else. We're not going to look at the value property in the case that the action type equals input blur. So I'll just keep watching, but that does make sense to me. So we're going to check if the action type is input blur. Okay, so all this is doing is saying if we've changed something within that particular box, within the email box when we're typing in, we want to return the original state. So just keep what we have there in the box. And this state, when you're using it with the reducer function, what this does, or useReducer, it gives you the exact state, the previous state. So you don't need to worry that React may not have properly updated the state yet if you're tracking different states and maybe you didn't get to that state and you've got an older version of a state, which is one of the problems with using the use state on different things and then trying to work with them all together. Whereas if you do it in one object, this state is the last state, it's guaranteed to be. So that's why this is a little bit safer. So then in here, we're going to return the object of value and state dot value, and then if it is valid, yeah, we want to just keep that same value that we had before. So state captures the exact value, and we want to check if this is valid. So state dot value dot includes, yep, and the @ symbol. Da 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 da. My @ symbol is in two different places, in work and in my home computer, so that's confusing. Well, just sometimes I press the wrong button, so. Okay. And something else to note here is that the original value we're passing into this form is dun, 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 here. This is it, isn't it? Yeah. So the original value that we've passed in is an empty string, and then is valid is false. So if we instead change this to null, then we should remove that just syntax highlighting, the highlighting that's happening immediately. Is that the right place to do that? Uno momento. Yeah. Oh no, it's not. Okay. So I'll just go back there. That wasn't the right place to do that. So where we want to do this is here. So we have our email state and our dispatch email being passed in, and this is the initial state that we pass in, because this is where that's being passed in. So if we change this value now to undefined or null, then we shouldn't get this highlighting on the box immediately, because it'll just be null. So that will allow us to just start with this clean form, as opposed to what we've seen before, which was that it was highlighting, it was telling it was false, so it was highlighting red. So it's just better to start off with the initial value of null. So we're starting with a blank slate basically, and this isn't being triggered as false before we've done anything. It just looks better. So that's what we've set up there. And now if I log in and provide a okay, so my password hasn't been set up yet because set entered password isn't coming back out. So we were using this set entered password to update the password with the event.target.value, which we're no longer doing. So we just have to continue on now, and we were just getting our email box working, but we still have to do our password, and then we'll continue. So just having a stretch guys, stretch, very important. We all need to stretch. So action.file includes, okay. Okay, yeah, so now we're going to just do the same for the password. So great. Okay, so all we're going to do now is just create a password reducer and do a similar thing to what we did before. So previously we were managing our password with our entered password and password is valid, but what we want to do instead is use a reducer. So we'll do constant, well first of all as well, well let's just declare this, and then all I'm going to do is just get rid of those old useState because we're not using them anymore. So password state, and then we have dispatch password, password, I'm just going to call this pass, because why make it so long for no reason when it's very obvious to me what that's doing, and hopefully to anybody else that's going to look at my code. So let's just go with this one. So this is pass state, pass dispatch pass. Then we want to use the reducer, and this is going to be the pass reducer. And then we have our initial state, which is still just going to be an empty value and null. So we'll do that. And that's because we just want, initially we're going to have no value entered into that box, and we don't want that box highlighting a different colour. So pass reducer is not defined. Yes, okay. So we're going to do that. So then here I'm going to just get rid of these because we're not using these anymore. Our entered password and our password is valid. So I'll just get rid of those and then make sure that there isn't other places where these are being used. So entered password is not defined. So let's find where we were using that. Okay, yes, so this is going to be our val instead. Okay, so we'll just leave them there for a minute because it will actually help us figure out, well, I'll actually just do this and then I'll go back and take them out, and then it'll help us figure out where we need to put in our pass password coming from our password reducer and our useReducer instead of our useState. So let's just continue here with const, and this is going to be our passReducer function, and this again takes a state and an action, and this a function that takes in those two things. So we're just setting this up, and then we are going to have different action types passed in. So it's going to be the same, but I just want to see, okay, yeah, so now in our password change handler, we have our event, and what we're going to do is use that event to update with the dispatch pass function. We pass in our object, we give it a type, and then we give it the value, which then we can go and use in other places in our code. So we have our dispatch pass here, which is the inbuilt function that comes with our useReducer for our password, and this is what updates this pass state. So we declare that function here, dispatch email, and this is going to take an object, and our object is going to be similar to what we have above. So we have a type, and this is going to be user input again, because that makes sense, because if the user inputs something, this is what we want to do. So we've just given it a way of identifying that user input. So if the type is user input, then we want to extract the val, or the value, which is the event.target.value. So now we can access this val and the type in other places of our code. So this is our event.target.value. There we go. Cool. And that makes sense. So now, when we're setting the form as valid, we want to use our event.target.value. For a password, for an email, okay. So event.target.value, yes. Type user pass input. So just so we don't get confused, which we shouldn't, because these are two different functions that are being called. So we have our dispatch email and our dispatch pass. This should be obviously dispatch pass, because we're updating this is the dispatch function on the password that we want to run and pass it this object, not actually the email one. So because we're in our password change handler here, so when we change something on the password, we want to call this dispatch pass function. We want to pass it in a type. We can give it any ID here that we want, or string, or we can pass in whatever we want to this dispatch pass thing, but we're passing in an object with a type to identify it, and then the value itself. So everything looks okay there. And then when we're setting the form as valid, we don't have this email state because we're not using the state anymore. So we want to actually use this event.target.value, which is coming in from the event of changing the password. So it is the value that we put into that password box. So we put this here instead, and this is for the password. So that should still be the email, and here this should be event.target.value, because we have the event target value of the password coming in as the event. That is the event in this case. So okay, and then I think we're going to have to change this email state, but I'm just going to watch for a minute so I don't go waffling and doing things wrong. Okay, yeah, so in our password reducer, which is here, yeah, I will just type this out. So what we're going to do is have an if statement as before, and if the action dot type, and this time I called it something slightly different, which it doesn't have to be, but just to make sure that we really see the difference here, this is going to be user pass input, and then just to show you, we'll leave the second one the same because they're two different functions, so it's not going to run the wrong one. You know, we need to be running the pass reducer, and then we get the action type once we've called out pass reducer, and if it was email reducer, then we're looking at the action type on the email reducer. So by first of all declaring these different functions and then passing in the action, well, the action is going to be different whether it was the email reducer or the pass reducer called, depending on how we wanted to use it. So here we're going to return the value, and the value is just this action.value. Yeah, action.val, because that's what we've called it. So we have our action coming in and we've declared type and val on that. So here's the type, which is switching, allowing us to decide what to do. So on the user pass input, if we passed in this particular type, then we want to just return the action.value and also check if it's valid. So to do that, we just do is valid, and in the case of the password, we have a different thing that we want to run. So what we want to do on the password is check if it's greater than 4 characters, and I'll change this to 3 just so like it can be a minimum of less characters. So is valid is going to be action dot action.value dot val dot trim, and the length is greater than 3, let's say. That can be anything you want. This is the own validation that you've put on this particular item, so you could validate it however you like, but this makes sense for a password. Really the 6 made more sense, you know, if it was a real thing. I just don't want to be typing 7 characters before I can click login for testing purposes. So this could be tightened up in the case of a real application, and you will probably do a lot more validation on the email than just checking the @ because that doesn't really tell you if you do indeed have a valid email. But for the purposes of learning, that's alright. And then we're going to keep the second bit because we can call this whatever we like, and by passing in either pass reducer or email reducer, we'll already be accessing different types within that, so we can still call it the same thing. So here we have, if our action type on the pass reducer is input blur, then we want to return state.value, which is the original state and the value of that original state, and then if it's valid, we want to also run this instead, because we're no longer looking at the email, we're now looking at the password, and the validation of the password and the email are different. For the password, it's just about how long it is. For the email, it's if it contains the @ symbol. So cool. Yes, and then under the login, now we want to call the useReducer. So here we're going to say useReducer. Well, we did that, didn't we? He's just doing what we've already done. So now he's defining this, but we already have that. And we've passed in our initial function, so we have that all done here. Okay, yes. So then down in our email change handler, right down here where we were first initially checking if the form was valid by running this validation, we already have that validation done further up here. So all we need to actually do is check if it is valid. So down here, what we're going to do instead is just check the password state and check if it is valid. So the current state of the password, so pass state dot is valid, which is just doing that somewhere else now. Yes, yeah. And then on our password change handler, we want to use this dispatch pass in order to update the password with this particular function instead. So that's also okay. Yeah. Yes, and then down in our validate password handler, in here we just also want to use the dispatch pass function that's attached to that useReducer functionality. So we have our dispatch pass, and this time we're just going to send it in the input blur, which is just going to check the current state and keep the current state for us. So if someone has just pressed in the box, so the type is going to be input blur in this case, and we could call this whatever we want. Input blur is what we have called it up above, so we have to keep the name the same. So here we have input blur in our pass reducer. So okay. And now yes, and also here then we also don't care about the input state here or the entered password here. What we care about instead is our value. So this needs to be password state, pass state dot value. Okay. So yes, so now where we're checking in our return for different things, we need to change this. So here we have our email state dot value, yes, and then in our password we actually want our pass state dot value. And now if we've successfully updated everything, this should all be grey. So we still have an instance of password is valid somewhere, because we can see that this hasn't been grayed out. So if I just do CTRL and F and look for this, and here instead this should be pass state, pass is valid, dot is valid, because that's how we're checking for the validity now. And then if I go down, okay, so now that's the only instance. So now we can get rid of this, and we've done it with our useReducer instead. So now this should all work, and I should only need 4 things to make this valid, because I changed the validation settings. And now we've logged in, so that's good news. Okay. Okay, so cool. Don't know why it's still not saving the fact that we've logged in. But Okay, so Max has said that this still isn't optimal. So let's figure out why this isn't optimal, because, that seems important. So I'm just going to listen to that again. But what he's saying is that this set form is valid. This still isn't optimal. And it's because the state can still change. So you might be comparing the wrong thing. And I thought that this past state was the exact state of the thing. Thought that was the point of this. So anyway, I'm going to just listen and see what he says, because I'm not sure why. But he's going to give us the optimal solution. But I thought we were getting there. So anyway. Sorry. Just couldn't see my hair. So the way React schedules the state updates is the problem here. So by passing in the past state and then is valid, I think this is the suboptimal part. Still need to do a bit more digging on this. This is the bare bones, the underneath the hood. Well, not the bare bones, the opposite of the bare bones. Bare bones is like the stuff on the surface, the easy stuff, I think. This stuff that Max is going on about now, about how React handles different states, I feel like this is sort of the stuff that you learn as you go, and you get more and more confident and understand more and more about the inner workings of a framework or a language as you continue to learn about it. And you really do have to learn these things. A great book series that I recommend to everyone is You Don't Know JavaScript by Kyle Simpson. You don't know. You don't own me. That's what came up. You don't own me. You don't know JavaScript. Please. I own myself. You don't know JavaScript, and you can get this on GitHub for free, which is amazing because you can also buy it, and Kyle is just deadly as well. There's a service called Front End Masters, which is a brilliant service for learning all about the intricate details of coding and sort of this under the hood stuff that you do need to understand if you want to be the best coder that you want to be, which I'm sure anybody, a couple of years into their journey is starting to think, well, I want to learn this stuff and I want to learn it well, as opposed to let me start coding something. So depending on where you're at in your journey, and even I read this series in the beginning when I was starting off, and some of it didn't make sense, but that's okay. So Getify is Carl Simpson's name on GitHub, and he also is involved in Front End Masters. I'm going to write these down, so I'm going to include links to all of these. And Front End Masters is a paid for service, 40 quid a month, 40 euros a month. Quid is an Irish thing, so it's not cheap, for some people perhaps. But personally, I think it's worth it. If you're more than 2 years into your journey, you can get a lot more in-depth things. And this is just my own recommendation. I mean, maybe you can want to get a free trial. So everybody at any stage of your journey, go for the free trial and check it out and decide for yourself. But Front End Masters is a paid for course area like Udemy. And once you pay the 40 euros a month, you have access to all the courses there. And they really are explained by really knowledgeable people in the industry, like Carl Simpson, who's wrote a whole book on understanding the real inner workings of JavaScript. So to write a book like that, you have to be, really understand this stuff. It's not just some guy on YouTube who, these guys on YouTube have honestly given me my career in the industry. So that's a great place to start as well. But I think the paid for courses, you get the backup code. If you get stuck on a YouTube tutorial series, and a lot of the time they don't provide the code, and then you're sort of lost, So that can be a bit of a bummer, you know. You've gone halfway through this big long series on how to build a Laravel application or something, and then you're stuck halfway and looking at his videos and comparing your code, and you just don't have the knowledge to figure it out yet, or you just can't figure out what's going wrong, and then you're stuck. Whereas with the paid for courses on Udemy, which you can often get for 14 quid, they have the backup code, as does O'Reilly, which again is a paid for service, even more expensive than Front End Masters. So go for the free trial of both O'Reilly and Front End Masters, give them a go, see what you think, and if you continue to like them, then you can continue to pay, and if not, we all know how to continue to roll over a free trial. You know, if you really want to just finish a particular course or something, you could just keep getting a few free trials. Obviously that's not ideal long term, because you just want to keep your progress and figure out where you're at and have that all trackable. But I recommend Front End Masters, and for a free book series, where would you get it? Like Kyle Simpson here, You Don't Know JavaScript Yet. This was the 2nd edition, so he's done even more, and I mean, it's just so good. These books are brilliant. He understands JavaScript at such a great level, and he's passing on that information to you. And it's things like scoping, like the scope of an object. Where if you declare a variable, where does that variable lie? Where can it be used? Where can it not be used? Things like how things are being executed in the code, at what different levels it's being executed, or in what run order, I should say. And Front End Masters is great for that as well. They go through it on the board. They show you this call stack. They show you the running stack and things like that. My terminology is all over the place, but go and learn about it and you'll know a lot more. And yeah, I should actually watch a few of those videos and relay some of that information, because it was so valuable. And still, like me relaying this information about Max's course, you're going to pick up things as I go explaining them, but you know, go to the horse's mouth and hear from those guys as well. You know, you can learn all over the place. Just keep learning, and once you're picking up things as you go, or even just watching, some of it's going in and you are getting better. So that's my advice as well. Just put in the hours. So yes, here on Carl Simpson's main page, there he is. Woo, hey Carl. So there's the You Don't Know JavaScript series, and he's one of the teachers on Front End Masters, which is why I went on a big tangent. So You Don't Know JavaScript is here, and this is the book series. There we go. Get started, scopes and closures. There's even more books. So get started. Oh. If you're looking for the previous 1st edition, okay, they can be found here. So we've updated them now. So here we go, right? You've got up and going, which is just to get you up and going. Then you've got scopes and closures, which is how a variable is scoped, or a constant when you declare let or const, how that is actually scoped within the code and which blocks you can use it in. So like this particular, like, do I have a function here that's sort of scoped? Everything is scoped, but like I'm trying to find an example that makes sense. So like we've passed in the state and the action here, so they can be used in here. But if we declared something in here, so my const equals, it's going to be a string of hello, we can only use this within this particular function definition because it's scoped and it has a closure. So his books explain all about that. These are free. Then he has this. So you know the this keyword and how that works. Sometimes it's not, like, it took me a while to figure out how to use that in code, because you think when you do this dot and you're going to get a particular thing and then you get something else. So this, because I just didn't fully understand how this was actually operating. So this and object prototypes, that goes through explaining that to you. And the object prototypes is in your console. When you go to your console and you see your object, and then you have the prototype, which is all the different functions that you can run on it, that goes through that. Types and grammar, so the types that you can use within JavaScript. Async and performance. So async, that's so important, async and await. I actually need to read this series again. Async and await. And then you have ES6 and beyond, so like your new arrow functions and the way things are done in this format. He goes into speaking about that, and he's doing he's revamping them. So I highly recommend this book series. I will include this in the description box below. It's free if you come onto GitHub. And look, if you really, really like it, which you will, I suggest becoming a Patreon or giving him, you know, so there we go. I also have JS material on Front-End Masters. Or if you really like it, buy one of the books, because, you know, he's put in all of this effort and it's so invaluable. And your favourite book, buy a copy of that book, because it's always useful to have an actual physical copy, I find. And that's what I do. So, you know, if you really enjoy something, that's what I recommend anyway. You know, this guy's put his time and effort into creating all of these fabulous resources for people for free, so it's amazing. So we'll just continue on here and listen to Maximilian. But those links will be included in the description box. So you know what, guys, we've hit the hour. And considering we left on some really, really key pieces of information that, you know, there are two resources that have seriously helped me on my journey. Front-End Masters and Carl Simpson's books. So they'll be included in the description box down below. Thanks so much for joining me here in 100 Days of Code. I'm Lilly Code. Please do like and subscribe if you like my content. It means the world to me. And have an absolutely wonderful day, all you coders out there. Time to go and have some breakfast and relax before I start work. So thanks for joining me. Bye, guys.